This is Let's Talk Energy, your go-to podcast for smart energy insights. I'm your host, Noah Brenner. And each week, we're unpacking the most important developments in the energy world through conversations with our own Rystad energy experts, as well as some special guests. In today's episode, we're clearing the air on carbon capture. Carbon capture and storage has gained traction in recent years as one way to tackle hard-to-abate emissions, and could get a further boost when countries submit their updated emissions reduction plans at COP30 in Brazil. Rystad Energy data shows project delays are growing, and the number of new projects being announced is going down. On the other hand, we are also seeing plenty of momentum in specific industries. I have Yvonne Lam, head of Rystad Energy's carbon capture and storage research, joining me today in Oslo to find out where CCUS is going next. Yvonne, welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Well, let's talk energy. Before we dive into our conversation, when we say CCS or CCUS today, what is it that we're actually talking about?
So in simple context, CCUS stands for carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So I'm sure this is not something new, but essentially it actually consists of capturing the CO2 because many of these things that we are doing, it's actually emitting CO2, and that's actually causing the global warming, right? So we need to capture the CO2 to reduce our emissions, but after you capture them, you need to transport and store them permanently so that it doesn't get back to the air. And in some parts, you could actually use the CO2 as well. So that's where the utilizations comes into picture.
Okay, and we're going to be primarily talking about the capturing and the storing portion of it, I think, in today's program probably. And so, but I want to broach maybe what's perhaps the gorilla in the room or so is there is criticism of CCS, particularly, there's an idea that it's not necessarily the cheapest way to reduce emissions. And this is even, I hear this from people within the industry.
Absolutely. I mean, CCUS is not really something that everyone agrees to. But when you think about carbon reductions, it always goes step by steps, right? So there's always no one solutions that can help you to actually take away all your emissions reductions. So there are multiple different solutions. I would say it's an and rather than or. Okay. Right? So you always start off with the cheapest options. I mean, who doesn't like doing the cheapest way first, right? So you would, for example, exhaust all your cheapest options like carbon efficiency improvements or even like electrifications because they cost you less to do that, right? Then you will have a big chunk of them which you are not able to electrify, so you are not able to reduce the emissions through efficiency anymore, that you will need to capture the CO2. But even capturing CO2, you will not be able to 100% abate these emissions. Okay. You will still have a remaining of 10% or so, which you have to actually use removal. That means that these are unavoidable emissions that release to the air. So you have to find ways to take it back from the air and store it underground. So that's what we have. Direct air capture means you directly capture the CO2 and storing them. Or even like BECCS, bioenergy with carbon captures, whereby the plants take in the CO2 and then you store the CO2 after it's being captured as well. Okay.
And so, lots of things we can try to reduce emissions, and CCUS is for those really difficult cases where we can't necessarily electrify, we can't necessarily do other things, efficiency and gains like that. But I mean, the other criticism that I hear is that not all CCUS projects are necessarily performing up to their capacity. Is that a fair criticism necessarily?
Well, if you are cherry picking, of course, that's really the case.
Okay.
Right?
Tell me more.
We have to think about the bigger context. But just to come back to your questions just now, on CCUS is actually very expensive, right? I wanted to give you some idea on how expensive it is, right? Okay. So I think the most common usage of CCUS, where many people have talked about, is to use them in the cement industry, right? So the cement productions itself emit a lot of CO2. And if you were to pay about $80 per ton of cement productions today, adding a CCUS plant to it, it would double the cost.
Oh, wow.
So that means instead of $80 per ton, you have to pay $160 per ton. So that's why people are criticizing it, because if you're putting your money to it, you need to make sure that it is actually worth the money that you're putting to it and they are paying for it, right? So in that case, these criticisms are, of course, have their own validations. So the data is right, but we need to look into the bigger context, right? You can, of course, cherry pick the worst or like the bad examples, but there are also many good examples. I mean, like in Norway, we have like Sleipner, Snøhvit projects, which have been storing CO2 since the 90s. So it's like 30 years now, almost. And then we also have, like in Canada, the Quest projects have been capturing and storing the CO2 from hydrogen plants, which is also like working quite well, right? And then on the other hand, you have the Gorgon project, which is...
Gorgon is the one I hear.
I get this a lot. Like, they always challenge and say like, oh, Gorgon's data is like so bad. Like, it's CCUS really working, But we try to actually look into the data and the research in here, right? This is what we do, right? So when we look into all these operational projects, look at what is the reasons that they are meeting or they are not meeting the targets that they were talking about, right? So what is actually evident is that many of them not meeting the storage targets that they have set. It's not because they are not able to capture the CO2 up to the volume that they expected. It's because of the CO2 storage. That means that you're not able to store after you have store as much as you want to after you have captured the CO2.
Which I found surprising. I had expected the industry has a lot of experience in geology. I sort of thought that part would be easy and the capture part would be harder. But I guess that's not the case.
Well, the CO2 storage, even though we know a lot, but doesn't mean that we know everything. Right? So just put into context is that, the oil and gas industries, we also learn along the way, right? It's been a long learning process. But what is challenging with CO2 storage is that you can do a very good job in terms of looking into the geological storage, make assessments of that, right? But you cannot predict how or where the CO2 is actually going to move after it's been injected, right? So you can, of course, have simulations to try to estimates or look at what and where it is actually going. But sometimes some of these things, first of all, because of lack of data, there's only a handful of operational projects out there. So there's not much of a learning or data or references that you can take from there, right? So everything is new. Everything is like, well, you have to actually like start from scratch. There's a lot of unknown in the industry. So in short, even though people think that, okay, they know a lot about the storage, but not everything is known.
Well, let's dive in a little bit on those costs and who pays those costs and what that means for business models that have evolved around CCS. And I mean, in particular, what types of industries are we seeing CCS take off in, and how are they sharing costs and coming to, how is that influencing, I guess, the business models that we're seeing in the industry as they evolve?
That's a lot of questions to answer in short. But
break it up.
Yeah. Well, who is paying for it now?
Let's start there. That's where the rubber hits the road.
So who do you think is actually paying for it now?
Well, I would assume, like everything else, eventually the consumer will have to pay for it. But right now, I would think it's probably governments, maybe, because of the amount of subsidies that CCS is receiving.
You are absolutely right. So eventually, the consumer is going to pay for it. But even government subsidies, where are the governments getting the money from? It's from taxpayer.
Yes, you're right. We are paying as taxpayers.
Exactly. So it's actually coming from the taxpayers, right? So I think one of the misconceptions is that it's not that. Many times, if we are actually picking the context in here, right, it's that it's not that people are opposing doing it. It's about like making sure that the money that's been spent, it actually have its good cost. That means that it's actually putting the value to it, right? But CCUS, people don't really see the value because essentially it is a waste management.
Okay.
Right. You can, of course, see it from a commodity perspective. But the commodity part of it is very small. I mentioned just now, it's like capturing, transporting, and storing CO2. You are not creating anything that you can sell, right? You can actually make it into a commodity by creating carbon credits, which is another topic that we can discuss another day, and also utilizing the CO2. But that is a very, very small portion of the entire CCUS value chain. So just come back to your question just now. When it is a waste management, right, people would expect that someone is actually going to take care of it, right? And we have had the privilege of like enjoying free releasing that into air. So basically all the, we are actually on the expense of environment when we are actually emitting CO2. But the difference now is that we have to pay for it. Of course, no one wants to do that. No one wants to pay for it, right? So with that regard, the government have to step in. So like you say, now, in a lot of these projects that managed to get into FID, we have a couple of like projects that managed to get into FID this year. It's because they get very, very heavy support from the government. So we could almost make a statement that no support, no FID. FID means final investment decision.
Yes.
Right? So the cost of CCUS actually consists of capture, transport, storage, and then I'll leave utilization for next time. But the value chain of that is that the capture part is the major part of it. About 60 to 90% of that is the cost coming from the capture part. You have the transportation and storage. And the transportation and storage, we just call it the infrastructure. You know, it's just like how road transport. You need to have road transport that connect you from one place to another before you would see it turn into a city. Right, a large-scale city, right? So in that case, none of them will be able to actually go if it's a standalone.
Yeah.
So you need to have capture.
A network.
You need to have the network as well to actually go hand in hand before you can actually move the project, right? So and then in terms of like the cost, it depends on the concentration of the CO2. Okay. I talk about the capture being the biggest part of it, right? If you have an emissions facilities, or like a facilities that emit CO2, if your CO2 concentration is low, then good luck. You have to pay a very hefty price for it.
Okay.
Yeah. But if you have a very high concentrated CO2 stream, then it is much easier to capture the CO2. So in that case, your cost could be lower. So we are talking about bioethanol plant. You know how bioethanol is being produced? Or, you know, just like brewing beer. Do you brew
basically.
your beer?
I have brewed my own beer, but it wasn't great.
Yeah. So we are talking about range. So brewing the CO2 coming from bioethanol, which is a fermentation process, it can be around like $30 per ton for capturing the CO2. But just take the example of cement that I talked about just now, right? It could take you as high as like $150 per ton to capture the CO2. You see that that's a big range in there, right?
What does that mean? Everything that you've told me in terms of where the costs are and how they're kind of incurred. What does this mean for the business model that might be sustainable, that we might be able to see emerge from this?
Yeah, so because of that, people are, or like project developers are very creative in terms of how they can make their bucket back, right? So for most cases, at least for now, because they are very expensive and there is not much of a willingness to pay from the consumer yet, right? It has to rely on government support. Okay. So I think I mentioned just now projects only able to get into FID because they receive government support, right? So that's one of the business model. But ideally, you need to have a market that actually goes on its own, right? So there are two mechanisms which currently it works quite well in Europe, which is the use of carbon tax. Essentially, it is a penalty or a stake, right? So when you actually impose a expensive enough penalty for emissions, which is comparable to the cost that you need to invest for CCUS, then it makes a business case, right? Okay. On the other hand, you have the support. So that's the carrots, right? So it depends on how much the government is willing to actually commit to your project. Then you would benchmark that against the price of it, your cost against the price that government is actually willing to do so. But since it is very capital expensive, government will not be able to spend on every single project. Exactly. You need to find other mechanism to fund your projects, right? So you will have very creative way, for example, selling that for credits. You have CCUS projects and direct air capture projects. Their main business case is to actually sell them as CDR credits, carbon dioxide removal credits. You will also see some of this industry which are more domestically produced. They have the ability to actually pass it down to the consumer.
Okay.
So like cement industry, you will not like import them in other places, right? From other places, right? For cement, right? Usually it's locally produced. In some contexts, of course, you do, but then in that case, it's easier for you to pass it down to the consumer. Then you will have this product, which is a green product, a green cement per se.
Yeah. Well, and are we able to see, I mean, obviously the costs are, maybe here now. What opportunities are there to get them to maybe a lower level? Is it technology? I mean, obviously, the industry is big on standardization and the efficiencies that come with scale, but we haven't necessarily, it doesn't sound like, hit that point yet. And so where are the opportunities, I guess, to lower those costs?
Yeah, so there are two ways that you can actually lower your costs of project work. One is the economic of scale that you mentioned just now. Another one is through learning curve, which means that you improve your technologies over time and then it becomes cheaper and cheaper. Right, so let's talk about the first one, economic of scale. So because the CCUS market has developed in a slow pace, just put it away, we haven't seen like really large scale deployment. There are some projects here and there, but it's not really like up to the scale where you would see like it makes a difference in terms of economic of scale. So that it's delay. So that means we haven't really seen the impact of economic of scale yet. Hopefully next year. Next decade.
Oh, less good.
Yeah, not so soon, like it takes years. But hopefully next decade, we could see this coming. And then another part of it is the learning curve.
Okay.
Right? So learning curve, it depends a lot on the technology. In our research, we have looked into more than 100 capture technologies players out there, right? So we have a catalog sort of that looks into, okay, what is their TRL numbers, what is their energy consumptions, and etc. In particular, these chemical absorptions capture technologies, they stand out as the most matured ones, and then it's been exist since the 1980s. And then when we look at or analyze the energy consumption for the different technology players, and if we plot the chart, right, with these data points, we see a very systematic reductions of energy consumptions. So that means that cost is actually coming down because your energy consumptions, it's lower and lower. So how much are we talking about? So we are talking about we are actually like on the path to 40% reductions in terms of energy consumptions since the 1980s.
Okay, so
that's actually quite
material reductions.
Yes, but that's just for one technologies, right? There are many different types of technologies out there to capture the CO2. So in that case, other types of technologies, they are not as mature as this. So there's still a lot of learning that could be taken from there. I would say chemical absorptions probably it's already at a plateau because it exists since 1980s, right? So in that case, not much of a learning. There will still be some, but it's like not as much as the newer upcoming technologies, right?
And the development of the supply chain obviously is going to have a big impact on the cost. But I'm wondering, how well developed is the supply chain? And if we do see projects come forward through to FID, could we see a shortage of capacity in the supply chain and actually see project inflation because of that?
Do you mean like if all the projects that are currently in pipeline just go ahead?
Not all of the projects in the pipeline go ahead, but certainly if we do begin to see some of these more conceptual projects actually take FID, given the government support that does exist in some jurisdictions, and we'll talk more about policy here in just a second.
Yeah, but if it's just some of this like projects that manage to actually get fundings from the government, no, in short, we will not see a supply crunch because it's just a handful of them, right? But if we are talking about like all the projects coming at the same time, then of course you will have that, right? But before we get there, or even if we will get there, right, a lot of things needs to align. all the stars needs to align before that could happen.
So I don't need to stay up at night worrying that we're going to see an overflow of projects overwhelming.
What we saw is that it's not really a supply chain crash, but it's in Europe in particular. Mm-hmm. We analyze like all these projects that are currently in Europe, and then like the availability of CO2 storage. There's in fact a lack of CO2 transportation and storage in Europe. So the main reason is because in Europe, many people have actually projected that EU ETS or like your carbon tax is just going to be very expensive in the next decade. So from the emitters' perspective, it's like, oh, I should start to do something now, right? Yeah. So very eager to capture the CO2, transport and store the CO2. But for transportation and storage providers, they're like, oh, there's not much of an incentive that I'm getting, right? So why should I get into this business? So there's only a handful of them. It's available in the market, at least in this decade, right? So you're left with like not much of an option. So from a emitter's perspective, if I'm not able to transport and store my CO2, what's the point of capturing my CO2, right? So in that case, they could delay their projects. And we have seen a lot of projects delays. And in fact, we only expect like 30% of the projects that are currently in pipelines would become operational by 2030.
Wow. Okay. Well, I want to come back to kind of what we're seeing in project trends in a little more detail, but I do want to talk about policy. Obviously, you've mentioned Europe, but I mean, where are we seeing, if we look kind of across the globe, where are we seeing perhaps policies that are good, helpful in terms of advancing CCUS, and are there any that maybe are not helpful? What's kind of the policy landscape that we're looking at globally here?
Yeah, I think like that's probably the biggest or like the most upsides that we are actually like seeing, because there's a lot of positive policies that is favorable for CCUS that has happened in the past few years, right? So that's really good news, despite slower than expected deployment of CCUS, and the market is actually moving quite slow. But just across the globe, I will just give you some examples. One in each region.
The highlights.
Right. So in the US, there's a lot of uncertainty. Obviously, you know that,
yes.
Right, with Trump administration. But even that, the lucky thing is that CCUS is half-foot in oil and gas and half-foot in the energy transition, right? So the 45Q tax credits is confirmed that's going to be retained, and they even enhance the payment for tax rebate or like tax credits for enhanced oil recovery. So that's good news. Okay. But at the same time, he also have retracted a lot of actually policies that is favorable for CCUS as well. So on one hand, you have better support in terms of like financial support for CCUS in the US. But on the other hand, everything else it's like down the water.
So is this in terms of like carbon policies that would restrict carbon emissions or regulate carbon emissions that the Trump administration is undermining?
Exactly. So it's actually giving like mixed signal in there, right? But I would say the financial part is actually quite important. So he's actually taking it from the perspective of business, commercial perspective, rather than environment protections or like, abating the emissions perspective. And then in Europe, like we have, Europe is probably like most matured in terms of policies, right? I mentioned a lot about EU ETS, but that's just part of it. That just gives you a business justifications for CCUS. But in order for you to do CCUS, after you capture the CO2, you need to store CO2. And the first thing that you need to do for storing CO2 is to get the permits for it, right? And the reality is that in Europe, we don't really have a lot of countries that have a legal framework for CO2 storage, because this is so new.
Okay.
Right? So in that case, if you are not able, you don't even know where to apply for your permits, how are you going to actually develop your projects? Right? So the good news, I mean, like I was actually very excited for this development in Germany, because Germany is the largest emitters in the whole Europe, right? So they just passed a draft to actually amend the Carbon Dioxide Storage Act to actually lay out the legal framework for building the facilities for transporting and storing CO2 in Germany itself, right? So that was non-existent before.
So largest emitter, non-existent kind of regulatory
And we are talking
framework.
about Europe.
Yeah.
Right? So if Europe is this, imagine APAC.
Well, tell us what's happening in APAC, because I do hear about carbon capture projects, and I do hear about models emerging, but what's happening there?
Yeah. So APAC has always been lagging. I would say lagging behind like the developed countries, right? So US, Canada, North America, and Europe are the most advanced just from CCUS perspective. And then APAC, it's lagging. The main reason is because they're very expensive. And then the second reason is because the legal framework or the legislations is just not matured yet, right? So we are seeing that the first adoptions of CCUS is actually coming from developed countries. So in APAC, you have Japan, Korea, for example. These are the few countries that have had, sort of like a framework that exists for CCUS, right? But we have seen great progress in the last year and even this year itself. Malaysia, Indonesia, for example, now they, similar to Germany, they have a system in place for you to actually like apply for CO2 storage license. I mean, like imagine that if you are a project developer for CO2 storage, you don't even know what is your liability in case of any CO2 leakage, right? Would you actually get into the business?
No, liability would be the first thing I would want to know before I invested in anything of that nature.
Exactly. So in that case, like now there is a more clarity on what is your liability, how long is your liability, who is liable to it, and then what is your limit to it, how you can actually go about it, where you can actually, apply for the license. That's actually very important because you can't store CO2 everywhere. No one wants to have the CO2 stored in your backyard, right? So I think like these are some of the progress which I think, of course, is very exciting. It actually lays the foundation that is needed for CCUS projects. But also at the same time, we see a lot of support, especially like financial support that's actually coming up. So besides the one in the US, which is an enhancement, in Europe, we're starting to see individual countries. They are actually setting aside some funds to support CCUS, either for research or just like to build the infrastructure for it and etc.
So I want to talk about projects and kind of what we're seeing in terms of project trends. You mentioned that we perhaps see about 30% maybe of projects essentially going forward in the long term, if I heard you correctly?
Yeah, by 2030.
By 2030, okay. But I mean, we've also seen a rise in the number of projects that are classified as delayed, and we've seen fewer announcements of new projects. But help me make sense of kind of this set of numbers. What would you say is kind of a snapshot of where we are in terms of CCUS project development?
Yeah, I can see how this is a bit counterintuitive compared to what I've said just now, that policies are actually moving in the right directions, right?
Exactly.
But why it's projects like delay and then why it's like less projects being announced. So actually, you have to actually look into like the different regions, right? So just let's start with the US. The uncertainties, it's actually the biggest part of it. So project developers, they develop CCS projects not because they care about the environment. Of course, like some of them do, right?
I mean, they do care, but there needs to be a viable business case.
Exactly. It needs to make money.
Yes.
Right? So in that case, in layman terms, is that if it doesn't make money, or if I cannot see what is the risk return that I could get from my projects, then it's better to just wait and see, right? So Trump administration has actually created that kind of environment of uncertainty, not just for CCUS projects, but like for many other different
large investments
as well. So that, of course, have impacted and caused a lot of projects that would rather just put the project on hold until clarity. But there are some good news as well. Like some of them still managed to actually like get over the 45Q tax credits, as long as it's actually within their break even with their cost, right? They will still like go ahead with that, right? So that's like in the US, but if you look at in other parts of the world, in the UK or like in Europe itself, right? Many of these projects, they were announced in early of this decade. So like 2022, post-COVID, basically. Okay. Remember, during COVID or like just after COVID, we have a boom of, like green, a trend where everyone just like want to get into like the green business, right? Yeah. So many of these projects were announced in like 2021, 2022, and 2023. 2024, we start to see a slowdown in terms of like projects announced. So that's mainly because they were already announced.
Yeah, they've already announced their plans, and so they don't need to announce more until they start to move forward on the ones that they have.
Exactly.
Okay.
And also for the public, right? If you are not in the CCUS business, you'll be like, okay, you just keep announcing projects, but I don't see any progress. You need to start to show progress to actually let people have the confidence that this is actually working, right? So that's why we say that, 2025 onwards is to actually prove that CCUS, it works to help to reduce the emissions. And then also these projects, they are not just like announcing it for the sake of announcing it. They are actually like making a tangible movement to it. But of course, not all projects will move. Not all projects will turn into FID. There will be cancellations is expected, right? We have a lot of cancellations in the last decade, but it's a lot more better this decade because we have a lot more supporting mechanism. Policies is actually more positive or like better for CCUS. So if you compare this decade versus last decade, it's actually much better to get into the CCUS business in this decade compared to the last decade. And then it's going to be better. So I'm really looking forward to the 2035 target setting because only a handful of countries have stated that CCUS is part of the solutions in their 2030 targets. But 2035 targets, it's where we see that, okay, maybe there will be more countries that will start to consider CCUS as an abatement.
As a bigger role within their emission strategies.
Exactly. So when that happens, means that you could expect more support. You could expect that policies is going to be more tangible. That means that you can bet on something that the government is going to do. But of course, political changes, uncertainties could still come into play. There's still uncertainty into the market, but it's a lot better than before.
I want to put a bow around all of this and ask you, very quickly, what does, we've talked about different aspects of the industry. What does a future-proof CCUS industry look like 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road when it does come?
Well, I'm not even sure if this is actually going to happen.
Okay.
I don't want to break the news in here, but a future-proof CCUS market, it's like when the market would go on its own, right? You have like a dynamic market, basically. Supply and demand comes into play. You have like service providers, and then you have a demand for capturing CO2 and then like storing the CO2. But that means that you need to make sure that there is a reason for people that is actually paying for it, right? So you either need to be your penalty is high enough, right? Or it actually like force it down the throat, basically. Everyone just have to pay for their emissions, right? So I think that would be the case. But to be honest, I think like it's actually impossible to reach that without any interventions from government, right?
Okay.
So
we'll continue to see policy play a key role, even though it's going to be perhaps technology and business models that will enable the industry to get on a more sustainable footing. With that policy support.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Yvonne, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
So let's recap what we've heard today. CCUS projects are progressing perhaps more slowly than we might have thought a couple of years ago, but we are seeing projects move ahead, particularly in certain industries. Government policies are a key driver of the CCUS industry and are likely to remain so well into the future. But we are seeing new technologies, lower costs, and viable business models are beginning to emerge. Thanks for listening to Let's Talk Energy. This podcast is a production of Rystad Energy, produced by Laura Rodriguez Skaug and Både. Check out the show notes for further analysis on the topics that we've discussed today, and connect with us on social media. We're at Rystad Energy on all your major platforms, or you can catch up with us on the website. If you'd like to send us a question or reflect on today's show, please reach out directly. Our email is podcast@rystadenergy.com. And leave us a review while you're there and hit that like button. Finally, most importantly, don't forget to join us next week.